This is Mamuni. Thank you so much for being Amar Baba Ma.
Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. In this video, I am going to discuss and explain number 1, what is GST with examples. Number 2, what are the taxes which were replaced by GST. Number 3, what is tax. Number 4, what is direct tax. Number 5, what is indirect tax. Number 6, what are the products which are not taxed or covered under GST in detail, step by step, in the easiest way. So let's get started. Chalo, shuru kora jak. Now what is the full form of GST? The full form of GST is Goods and Services Tax. The Goods and Services Act was passed in the Parliament on 29th March 2017 and came into effect on 1st July 2017. GST is an indirect tax. GST is a tax that customers have to bear when they buy any goods or services such as food, clothes, electronics, items of daily needs, transportation, travel, etc. GST is not directly paid by the customers to the government, but is rather levied on the manufacturer or seller of goods and the providers of services. Understood? Please remember, GST is paid by consumers or customers indirectly, and that is the reason it is known as indirect tax. But GST is remitted to the government by the business selling the goods and providing the services. Okay? The sellers usually add GST into their cost of the goods and services, and the customers pay the price that is inclusive of GST. Thus, in most cases, the customers end up in paying a tax that is GST even if the customers are not an income tax payers. Understood? Because GST is an indirect tax paid by the customers indirectly to the businessman. What is the motto of GST? One nation, one tax. To make tax rate uniform throughout the country India, GST is an indirect tax which has replaced many indirect taxes. In fact, GST has replaced 17 indirect taxes except a few state taxes. The main objective of GST is to have uniformity of indirect tax rates throughout India. Pre-GST, there were different rates of sales tax or value added tax, that is VAT, in the states. So, the motto of GST is one nation, one tax. So, the motto of GST is that every state will charge the same rate of GST on the same product. Understood? Before the implementation of GST, same products were taxed separately by the individual state governments. প্রত্যেকটা state government আলাদা আলাদা tax rate charge করত. For example, pre-GST, Mr. X, who manufactures pens in West Bengal, charges 8% tax on the pens. Mr. Y, who manufactures pens too in Maharashtra, charges 10% tax on the pens. And Mr. Z, who manufactures pens in Rajasthan, charges 9% tax on the pens. তার মানে কি Mr. X, he manufactures pens and he is charging 8% in West Bengal. কারণ ও West Bengal এ থাকে. Mr. Y, he also manufactures pens, but he is charging 10% tax on the pens because ও Maharashtra তে থাকে. Mr. Z, who manufactures pens in Rajasthan charges 9% tax on the pens because he lives in Rajasthan. That means pre-GST, every state charges different tax rates on the same product pen. Understood? So the aim of GST is one nation, one tax, one market. The aim is to make tax rate uniform, same tax rate throughout the country. Suppose post GST rate is 5% on the pens. So Mr. X, who manufactures pens in West Bengal, will charge 5% on the pens. Post GST, Mr. Y, who manufactures pens too in Maharashtra, will charge 5% GST. Mr. Z, who manufactures pens too in Rajasthan, will also charge 5% GST on the pens. So, the tax rate is uniform throughout the country, India. Only one single tax. So, GST is a single domestic indirect tax law for the entire country, India. One single tax. 17 indirect taxes have been replaced or merged with GST. 17 indirect taxes is equal to one indirect tax, that is GST. So the conclusion is 17 indirect taxes has been replaced by one single indirect tax, that is GST. Understood? That is 17 indirect taxes is equal to one single indirect tax, that is GST. Understood? GST is a comprehensive, multi-stage, destination-based, value-added tax. Please remember, GST is an indirect tax, not a direct tax. Okay? Example of GST. Suppose I go out for dinner with Amar Baba and Ma on Durga Puja. In the bill, I may see my total amount for the Chinese food plus the GST, that is indirect tax. Let's say the bill was rupees 6,000. The cost of the total food is 6,000 and the GST rate is 5%. Then what will be the total cost? Then I will have to pay 6,000 plus 5% on the food. Then I will have to pay 6,000 is the total cost of the food plus 6,000 into 5 by 100, that is GST. Please remember, restaurant charges 5% GST in every state. One nation, one tax. Okay? So I have to pay not only 6,000. 6,000 is the cost of the food. But I have to pay GST also. So 5% on 6,000 is 300. So I have to pay 6,000 plus 300. That is 6,000 plus 300 will give you 6,300. So I have to pay to the restaurant owner rupees 6,300 and not 6,000 because I have to pay GST also. So the cost of the food is 6,000 plus GST. 5% on 6,000 is 300. So 6,000 plus 300 will give you rupees 6,300. So I have to pay to the restaurant owner rupees 6,300. Okay, this is the total amount I have to pay. So who is bearing the GST? The customer. That is me. I am paying the GST indirectly to the government. Okay, the restaurant owner is not paying the GST. I am paying the GST to the government indirectly. That is why GST is an indirect tax, not a direct tax. Okay, this rupees 300 is the GST, that is indirect tax, that is passed on to the customer, that is me, by the service provider, that is the restaurant. So I am paying the tax indirectly. I am paying the GST indirectly to the government. But the restaurant owner will pay the GST to the government ultimately. Okay? So rupees 300 is the GST paid by me, that is the customer, indirectly. But it is remitted to the government by the business, that is the restaurant, selling the goods and services. Understood? I hope you understood. Please remember, GST collected on supply of goods and services after deduction of GST paid on purchase of goods and services is payable to the government. Meaning, when the restaurant buys raw materials for the Chinese food, the restaurant has to pay the purchase GST. So when the restaurant is going to remit the GST price collected on supply of goods and sales to the government, he is going to deduct GST paid on purchase of goods and services. Understood? He is not going to remit the total GST collected on supply of goods and services. So the business and restaurant is going to remit the money, that is GST collected on the supply of goods and services after deduction of GST paid on purchase of goods and services is payable to the government. যখন চাইনিজ ফুডটা বানিয়েছিল তার জন্য কি কিনতে হয়েছে? অনেক র মেটেরিয়ালস কিনতে হয়েছিল. When he purchased raw materials for the Chinese food, he had to pay the GST. Understood? Purchase GST. So he will deduct purchase GST from the GST collected from the customers. Understood? Then he will remit the money to the government. Understood? Before understanding more about GST, let's understand what is tax, what is direct tax, and what is indirect tax. Please remember, the government of any country needs money for its functioning, and taxes are a major source of revenue for a government. Therefore, the taxes collected are spent by the government for the public. Taxes are an important and largest source of income for the government. The government uses the money collected from taxes for various projects for the development of the nation. Understood? Now, what is tax? Taxes are termed as obligatory or mandatory contribution or money made by individuals or corporations falling under the tax slab to the government of India. From local to national, taxes are applicable on all levels in India and are considered to be one of the major sources of income of the government. In other words, the government levied or imposed taxes on the citizens of the country to produce income for business projects, enhance the country's economy, and lift the standard of living of the people of the nation. What is direct tax? There are two types of taxes in India. One is direct tax and the second one is indirect tax. Please remember, GST is an indirect tax and not a direct tax. Okay? Direct taxes are non-transferable. Taxes paid by the taxpayer to the government directly. In other words, a taxpayer pays tax from his or her own pocket to the government. The taxpayer cannot shift his or her tax liability to someone else. Direct taxes are administered and governed by the Central Board of Direct Taxes, CBDT. For example, if you are working in an MNC and drawing handsome salary every month, on that salary you have to pay income tax during the year according to the income tax slab rates. And you cannot shift your tax liability to someone else. তুমি যদি MNC তে চাকরি করো, তোমার যদি স্যালারি income tax slab এ পড়ে, you got to pay income tax. So on that salary, you have to pay income tax during the year according to the income tax slab rates. Can you shift your tax liability to someone else? তুমি কি অন্য কাউকে বলবে আমার ইনকাম ট্যাক্সটা পেমেন্ট করে দাও? You cannot shift your tax liability to someone else. You have to pay your income tax to the government. Understood? So ডাইরেক্ট ট্যাক্সে তুমি তোমার ট্যাক্স লায়াবিলিটি শিফট করতে পারো না, তোমাকে পেমেন্ট করতেই হবে। আন্ডারস্টুড? অ্যান্ড প্লিজ রিমেম্বার, আ ডাইরেক্ট ট্যাক্স is directly related to income or wealth of the registered taxpayers and not goods and services. Okay? Now, who is an income taxpayer? An income taxpayer is any person who must file taxes and is in the income tax bracket that is payable. If the person's included annual income falls below the threshold among periodically, that is income tax slab rates set by the government, they are exempt from paying the income tax. Okay? কোনো পার্সন যদি এমন চাকরি করে তার স্যালারি যদি ইনকাম ট্যাক্স স্ল্যাবের মধ্যে না পড়ে, তাহলে he or she is exempted from paying the income tax. Understood? What is indirect tax? Indirect taxes are consumption-based taxes. Indirect taxes are levied or imposed on purchasing and selling goods and services. The supplier or seller of the goods or services pays the government an indirect tax, not direct tax. Indirect taxes are transferable taxes where the liability to pay the tax can be shifted to others like the consumers or customers. I have already shown you with an example. আমি যদি রেস্টুরেন্টে যাই, I have to pay the amount for the food as well as GST. So who is paying the GST? I am paying the GST indirectly. The customer is paying the GST indirectly. The restaurant is not paying the GST. The restaurant is only remitting the GST money to the government. Understood? So, the restaurant or business is shifting the tax liability to the customers. Understood? So, indirect taxes are transferable taxes where the liability to pay the tax can be shifted to others like the consumers or customers. For example, a seller adds the GST to the price of the product, and a customer or consumer who buys the product pays the sales price inclusive of the GST. So, GST ke payment korche? GST is paid by the customer. So, the GST money is going to be remitted by the businessman to the government after deducting the purchase GST. Okay? So, the indirect taxes are administered and governed by the Central Board of Indirect Taxes and Customs, that is CBIC. Understood? So, taxes can be classified into two types. Number one, direct tax. Number two, indirect tax. I have already told you what is direct tax. Direct tax is a tax when a person pays tax from his or her own pocket to government. A person cannot shift tax liability to someone else. What is indirect tax? I've already told you. Let me tell you again. An indirect tax is a tax when a person collects tax from a customer and pays it to the government. A businessman can shift tax liability to customers. Understood? So what are the examples of direct tax? Number one, income tax. Number two, wealth tax. Number three, estate tax. Number four, capital gain tax. Number five, prerequisite tax. Number six, corporate tax, and etc. What are the indirect taxes? 17 indirect taxes have been replaced by one single tax, that is GST. So what are those 17 indirect taxes? Let me show you. But please remember, direct taxes are still existing. Only 17 indirect taxes have been replaced or have been merged with one single tax, that is GST. But direct taxes are still existing. Okay? So these are the 17 central government taxes and state government taxes merged with GST. So 17 indirect taxes have been merged with one single tax, that is GST. There were 7 central government taxes plus 10 state government taxes. So in total, 17 indirect taxes have been replaced by one single tax, that is GST. Okay? There were 7 central government taxes plus 10 state government taxes. So if you add up 7 plus 10, 17 indirect taxes have been replaced. 7 central government taxes plus 10 state government taxes have been merged with one single tax, that is GST. Or 17 indirect taxes have been replaced by one single tax, that is GST. So what were the 7 central government taxes? Number 1, service tax. Number 2, duties of excise. Number 3, central excise duties. Number 4, cesses and surcharge. Number 5, additional duties of excise. Number 6, additional duties of customs, in short form CVD or countervailing duty. Number 7, special additional duty of customs, in short form SAT. So what were the 10 state government taxes? Number 1, entry tax. Number 2, octroi. Number 3, purchase tax. Number 4, luxury tax. Number 5, VAT or value added tax. Number 6, central sales tax or CST in short form. Number 7, entertainment tax. Number 8, taxes on advertisement. Number 9, state cesses and surcharges. Number 10, taxes on gambling and lottery. Understood? So these 17 indirect taxes were replaced by one single tax, that is GST. Pre-GST or before the implementation of GST, there were 17 indirect taxes and the businessman has to follow so many taxes. So GST or goods and services tax was implemented to reduce the number of taxes levied or imposed by the central governments and state governments to simplify the tax system. Otherwise, the businessman has to pay service tax, duty excise, octroi, purchase tax. So how many taxes the businessman will have to pay? So it was very difficult to deal with all these taxes. So that is the reason GST was implemented, to simplify the complicated tax system. Before the implementation of GST, the businessman had to follow 17 indirect taxes, which were very complicated. After the implementation of GST, the businessmen have to follow only one single tax rate, that is GST. Understood? Pre-GST, there were different rates of sales tax and value added tax in the states. Understood? Which were complicated. Different tax rates in different states. Understood? With the implementation of GST, there is only one single tax rate throughout the country. Understood? Having said that, please remember a few state taxes are still there. Please remember, at present, the following items are not taxed or covered under GST. For example, number 1, alcohol for human consumption. Alcohol for human consumption are not taxed under GST and instead are taxed separately by the individual state government. Even after the implementation of GST, there are still different rates of sales tax, value added tax and excise duties in the state. For example, alcohol for human consumption. Tax on alcohol for human consumption is one of the major sources of revenue to the states. and inclusion of alcohol under GST would mean that some part of the tax revenue would go to the central government. Please remember, if alcohol for human consumption is covered under GST, some part of the tax revenue would go to the central government. So before GST, the states levied or imposed VAT, that is value added tax, and excise duty on alcohol for human consumption. However, the taxes imposed to alcohol for human consumption will continue as per the structure before GST implementation, because alcohol for human consumption is not covered under GST. So the total revenue from the alcohol for human consumption will be enjoyed by the state government and not the central government. Okay? Since alcohol for human consumption is not taxed or covered under GST, so the total revenue from selling alcohol for human consumption will only be enjoyed by the state governments. Okay? Number 2, electricity. The electricity has been kept outside the purview of GST at present. So, however, the taxes applicable to electricity will also continue as per the structure before GST implementation. That is, electricity is taxed separately by the individual state governments. Understood? So, electricity is also not taxed or covered under GST. Electricity is taxed separately by the individual state governments. Understood? These are the exceptional cases. Number 3, petroleum products. GST was not imposed for these 5 products. Number 1, petroleum crude. Number 2, high-speed diesel. Number 3, motor spirit, commonly known as petrol. Number 4, natural gas. Number 5, aviation turbine fuel, that is ATF in short form. Currently, these 5 petroleum products are covered under VAT, that is value added tax, central excise duty and central sales tax. Yes, these taxes are still applicable in India. I have told you in the beginning, few state taxes are still existing even after the implementation of GST. So the revenue from alcohol for human consumption, or revenue from petroleum products, or revenue from electricity will be enjoyed by the state governments and not the central governments. Understood? Because these items are not taxed or covered under GST. I hope everything is clear now. So even after the implementation of GST, few indirect state taxes still exist, like VAT, that is value added tax, central excise duty and central sales tax. Understood? So what is the objective of implementation of GST or goods and services tax? Number 1, to simplify the complicated tax system. Number 2, to remove cascading effect of taxes. Cascading effect of taxes means levy of tax on tax. GST is levied or imposed only towards the net value added portion and not towards the full portion of value, as the taxpayer enjoys input tax credit. Goods and services will cost less due to removal of cascading effect of tax. Cascading effect means tax on tax. Due to input tax credit, GST would be finally paid by the consumer for the goods and services. I will explain the cascading effect in detail in my forthcoming video. Number 3, GST aims to promote economic growth. GST is expected to reduce the tax burden on business, encourage entrepreneurship and increase investment in the country. Okay? And GST also removes evasion of tax. Okay? I hope you understood and everything is clear now. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for your precious time. I sincerely hope this was helpful. I'll catch you all again in the next video. Till then, keep rising and keep shining. Bye-bye. Take care, stay safe and stay blessed always.